All right. I'll just go again. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the call, and we're extremely grateful to all. I'll just go over the blueprint and the structure we intend to follow during the course of the presentation, and there will be ample time dedicated to the Q&A. So everybody is encouraged to participate, guests and collaborators alike. All right, so the blueprint, the basic structure that the presentation will follow is that Rosanna will be giving the intro, and Anel will be presenting on data collection. Suzanne will be doing presenting on gridded population. Again, Rosanna will be coming back to model and analysis. Vamsi will be presenting Juba's recorded voice on food items, a tool that we have created. Anel will be talking about the limitations and improvements, suggestions, and Rosanna will be concluding with final remarks, team, and information. All right, so I'll just hand over the mic to now Rosanna, who can take this from here. Rosanna?
Yeah. Hello, I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks especially to Omdena and the World Food Program for supporting our project and for giving us the opportunity to talk about this very interesting topic that connects AI and humanitarian logistics. So this work will be presented by us, but was done, as Devika already said, through the hard work of the 34, at the beginning 40 members of our team. And we did this all in a very fast and very communicative way, and also through these complicated times that are the pandemic. So we can go to the next slide. So to start, I'll talk a little bit about the challenge, and in the next slide, I'm going to present of our sponsors, so we can have a better idea of how we came up with this challenge of AI for disaster response. So, so on one hand, we have Omdena, which is a very well-known global platform that puts together experts and data scientists to build AI solutions for real-world problems, such as, for example, the recent works on sustainability and renewable energies, and also natural disasters such as earthquakes or wildfires, and now this project about cyclones. And also, like right now, Omdena is finishing a project about the corona crisis that is also coming up in the next week. So stay tuned, because this is going to be also very interesting. And so from Omdena, we had the help from the beginning from Ruth and from Devika, especially Devika helping us throughout this whole process to design our solutions and working as kind of as design thinking evangelist for our team. And also from the World Food Program, we had the help from Raghu and Kyriakos and Nitima that helped us to understand what are the needs from the World Food Program and how we could use AI to come up with solutions that could help them. So the World Food Program is a branch of the United Nations, and is currently the largest humanitarian agency addressing hunger in the world. So they provide assistance to more than 90 million people per year, and they help the countries that we can see here, like more than 83 countries that are highlighted here in blue. So now you can go to the next slide. And we can talk finally about our challenge. And so as we saw, whenever there is a crisis, the humanitarian agencies will come up to help. And in the case of natural disasters, this help will come in the form of delivering relief packages for the affected population. And whenever there is an emergency, the most important human needs are water, sanitation, food, and shelter. And this, of course, has to come very fast, because these people are in a very special situation where they need to have help as fast as they can. So to know beforehand what items are necessary and which quantity, so that the humanitarian agencies can already have storage and deploy ready for like on-call send this help to these people is extremely important, and this is a very serious problem for management and disaster response. So the goal of our project was to develop the first tool to help with disaster logistics, specifically for cyclones. And this would be like, there was no such a thing before, specifically for cyclones, and we are glad to help to share that we actually did it. So this was a lot of work, and we will share with you the story of how we got to this tool today. So if you go to the next slide. So we will start, also we can go to another one, to understand the problem. So from the first week of the project, like this challenge was done, as I said, in 2 months, so in 8 weeks. And in the first week, we basically spent a lot of time being very nerdy and going to several readings of reports and articles about cyclones and cyclone response to understand how these natural disasters actually affect people, to understand who are the people that actually need help, and to come up with this idea, like broader idea of how this problem can be solved. So I think we all know more or less like what cyclones are. So cyclones are large scale areas of around hundreds of kilometers of air mass swirling around the center of low pressure. So I mentioned wind and low pressure because this is actually important for our project, as we're going to discuss later. And whenever these cyclones happen, they are usually formed in the tropical areas, so in these central areas that you can see in this map here. And depending on the location where they are formed, they receive different names. So for example, in Asia, they are called typhoons. In America, they are called hurricanes, and in the other areas, so for example, to the east of Australia and in the South Africa and India, they are called cyclones. So we could identify from our studies in this week that usually when a cyclone happens, it brings a lot of damage and a lot of impact. And while at first it brings death, unfortunately, we have around 10,000 people that die by tropical cyclones per year. We also have a lot of injured people because of the cyclone path of destruction, destructing houses and damaging properties, buildings, and also infrastructure, for example, electricity or sanitation, leaving a lot of people without water and so on. So this is also very important to address these problems, and this is why the World Food Program could use some hand to make it more efficient. And this was the purpose of our project. And also, like just to give some perspective, we do have the problems of climate change. So climate change is a real phenomenon that is happening right now, and that unfortunately will make these kind of natural disasters and extreme weather events such as cyclones more often, and they are also becoming more extreme and more deadly. So this is very important. This is why we are addressing this problem. We can go to the next slide. So throughout this analysis or these studies that we took, we also realized that there is not so much data available or easily accessible regarding the logistics of cyclones and cyclone response. So we couldn't really just do something very straightforward and just see, oh, we just take the formal data from the past and see how we can predict this, because we just didn't have this data available. So we actually had to split this problem into two parts. One part, which we call phase A, which was determining the affected population, because this data was available, I think still not so much, but we could collect the data for affected population and use AI techniques to predict the affected population in the future of the future events based on several features that we're going to discuss very soon. And then after, in the second phase called phase B, we could, because the thing that we actually found in our data, or in our analysis, sorry, were the guidelines for estimating the food and non-food items given a specific population. So in the first part, we calculated or estimated the affected population. And in the second part, we use those guidelines to come up with a mathematical model to create these packages for relief of natural disasters. So as I said, we did it. So we have a solution. We have our first application for logistic disasters in given cyclones. And this was, of course, a lot of work. And this was divided in several tasks, such as, for example, data collection and aggregating all this data together, and then analyzing this data and coming up with models. So I will pass now to Anel, which was the task manager for data collection, and that will explain a little bit of this task. It was actually the longest one of the project.
Thank you, Razan. My name is Anel. As she mentioned, I am a data collection manager. Also, don't want to take all the credit. We had a lot of people contributing to this task, and it actually took a long time. Next slide, please. I will jump right in. So mostly our data set consists of 4 data sets. The first one is IBTrax, which is basically physical description of a cyclone, right? Actually, a lot of cyclones, and it's chronological. The next one is MDAD, that would provide several data points for cyclones, and most important ones would be human and economic information about disaster. How many people affected, how many people went homeless, how many people were injured. Those are very important because that is actually going to be our target variable for any model, for our model. The socioeconomic factors were mostly taken from World Bank indicators, and those are also proven to be very important. The very last one is that I'm going to talk about is gridded population of the world, and it's not just gridded population of the world, it's gridded population of the world overlapped with the track of the cyclone. Next page, please. A little more about IBTrax. This is example of aggregated table where you see several names of the cyclones. You see what their basins are, sub-basins, what is their nature, and you also see the aggregated timing of it, which is usually 3 to 6 hours. You see the coordinates that are moving, how many hours it took. There are actually a lot more columns. Next slide, please. Okay, a little deeper, again, about IBTrax. Nature could be tropical, extratropical, subtropical, and so on. We also have information like pressure, which is also very important, maximum wind, which will give us information of maximum width, and all that, and all, of course, scale that we're familiar with, which would be category 1 through 5. All that is per country. Next slide, please. This is illustration of basins. That's what it means. Basin is basically where the cyclone started. So cyclone could start in one part of the globe but end up in another. We also have sub-basins. For example, North Atlantic would have sub-basins of Caribbean Sea and Mexican Gulf. Next one. The next one is very interesting because it is both very helpful for our model and very challenging technically. It is exposure of population. Imagine if you have a map of density of population or how many people live in the country on certain area. We want to overlap that with the cyclone and see how many people were actually affected. Susan?
Okay, thank you for the introduction. My name is Suzanne, and in close collaboration with Geetha, I was working on the geospatial data approach. Basically, if you look at this picture, you just see a satellite image, and on this you see map like the path of a cyclone, and this is the cyclone. We will look in some more detail if we don't have a satellite image, but if we just have tabular data and how we can map this. Next slide, please. So basically, the information that is available through IBTrax is the name of the cyclone, the season, most important, longitude and latitude. And then we've got at each of these center points, we've got radios for the wind speeds of 34 knots per hour, 50 knots per hour, and 64 knots per hour. And out of this information, we are trying to build the shape of a cyclone that we can then map onto the gridded world population data set. Next slide, please. So basically, just out of latitude and longitudes, most people wouldn't know where we are on the map, so we are just mapping it on the world map to see where the cyclone happened, which is in Southeast Asia, and the next slide will just be zooming in into this one. So here you see basically most of the things that we have available, like the center points and a world map underneath. And if we combine those center points with a straight line, you can see it in the next slide. We've got like basically the main track or the highway of the cyclone where it's going through. But for sure, the highway is only like the center track. And as Rosanna told in the introduction, the radius of a cyclone is up to 200 kilometers and even bigger. So this doesn't really tell the story about who's affected. So in the next slide, please. You can see for the wind speed of 34 knots per hour, if we put like on all the center points, put the radius for the according information, you can see how we build up the shape of this whole thing. And you can also see that most of the cyclone is on water, on the ocean, but what we are interested is where is the cyclone on land. So you can also see it in the next slide, that if we also look at the wind speeds for 50 knots per hour and 64 knots per hour, this is just a fraction of the area that is really affected by the 34 knots per hour. And so in the next slide, we will look at, next slide, please. Look at which countries are really affected by the cyclone. So basically, the center path was just crossing through Thailand, but actually the cyclone was affecting people living in 4 countries in Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. And the first approach would be, okay, we hit Thailand, we take into consideration the whole population of Thailand, which wouldn't be somehow adequate. So you can see in the next slide that we are just trying to extract the area of the different countries that was really affected by the cyclone. And so basically we get a polygon shape for each country. Sometimes we get several polygons if we've got like several islands or hitting a country twice on several points. And then we can take this information, these shapes for each country, and map them on the gridded world population dataset. Next slide, please. Which basically looks like this. It's a world map. It's a data set that was aggregated, and it's providing information about how many people are living in a certain area per square kilometers. And you can really see that there are really huge areas with a lot of population in Asia and Southeast Asia, and like in Northern America, there's pretty much not so much going on. So basically, with the shapes that we extracted before, like we shown in the presentation, we can now map those onto this map and extract from this thing out the population affected that's for each country. So basically, you can see here that, as you've seen before, Thailand was majorly hit. It was the only country that was affected by the center path of the cyclone. And so it was also hit by max 34 knots per hour and 64 knots per hour wind speeds. And the other countries were just affected by maximum 34 knots per hour wind speeds. And we can extract from this information, like in Thailand, there were 7.6 million people exposed to the cyclone. Exposed is something different than affected. It just says they are living in that area. This is why we're not just saying here, this is what we need, but this is just one of the variables that we feed into our models. This is basically all we've done in the geospatial data approach, and I would like to hand over to the next presenter.
Next presenter is me again. I'm going to talk just a little bit about World Bank indicators. As I mentioned, we had to consider socioeconomic factors. Some of them proved to be very important. For example, Human Development Index or Gross Domestic Product. There are also other interesting features that were important and actually were affecting the results of the model. For example, the rural population, the percentage of rural population, density, of course, of the people living in the country affected. Next one, please. And the very last data set is data set obtained from MDAT, which is our target variable. MDAT actually has a lot more features, but those sometimes repeat themselves if you look at IB tracks. So our most important features that we extracted were affected population, injured people, and people who died, the death toll of the cyclone. The one that we used in our models were affected population. Next one, please. And of course, that data sets weren't perfect. We still had to do some manual search. After, for example, if we have something in IB tracks and maybe have something about target population, target label, which is population affected, we may be missing something in between, and we had to scrape some data from Wikipedia or do just manual search or find some reports from the country about the cyclone to fill in the data. Next one, please. This is just to summarize what happened. Just go to the previous one. Oh, next one, I guess, next one. Yes, this is illustration to summarize what happened with all the 4 data sets. The very first data set, if you remember, was IB tracks. No, just go to the next one. The IB tracks is the one that was aggregated to, next one. Okay, you removed it. The very first one, IB tracks, that was aggregated in order to fit with another data set. That's the one that was talking about cyclones and physical properties cyclones. After aggregation, we also extracted some features. Rosanne will be talking about it a little more. The next was Suzanne's data set, which was talking, features that how many people were exposed. Exposed is not exactly affected, but it's getting very close. So that was very important feature too. And we also have a socioeconomic data set that was joined together. And at the end, we joined the target label data set, which was population affected. I will give a presentation to Rosanne. Rosanne? Rosanne, do we have
You're mute. You're mute.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, sorry about that. So I think analysis are for the presentation about the data collection. So I'll continue from now explaining what we did in terms of analysis and modeling. So we can go to the next slide. And so after collecting all of this data, we came up with a final data set that aggregated all this information that we collected about cyclones, about affected population, about exposed population, and so on. So this was done in a data set of these 5 merged data sets. So in the end, we ended up with about 1,000 cyclone events and around 45 features. By features here, I mean these informations that we collected, like specific informations like the Human Development Index or the speed of cyclone and so on. So we started then to explore the data set, and in the first part, we can just have a look into how, given the information that we have, the data that we have available, how it is distributed around the world. So we can see in this color scale here in pink that the darkest parts are the most affected countries. So we can see that in America, mostly United States and Mexico are the most affected by cyclones, but of course we also have some parts in Central America. We also have some countries affected in the south of Africa and especially Madagascar. And in Asia, we have several countries affected, and especially China, the Philippines, Japan, and Vietnam. So we can go to the next slide. We can also see, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we have some little data regarding the affected population. So for example, for IBTRAC's dataset, which was the one that Anel mentioned with the information about cyclone, there are about 25,000 cyclone events. And this is like the history of the cyclones that we have since the 1950s till this year. But we don't have so much information regarding the affected population, which is in pink here. So the pink data here is the data that we actually had available because it was the only data that had information about affected population. We can go to the next one. Then if we keep exploring this data set, we could, for example, identify that most of the cyclones that we have data available were tropical storms or category 4 and 1 cyclones, and not so much information about the other categories. We could also see that, as was already mentioned before, that most of the cyclones happen in this basin area, which is where they are formed, which is in the West Pacific. So most of the data that we actually have is for Asia. And you can go to the next one. And one important thing that we identified was that the affected population is strongly affected whether the cyclone lands or not. And by landing, I mean like the cyclone has like a circular area, and it, like if the center reaches the land, and not they usually are formed in the ocean, so when they reach the land, they actually increase a lot the number of affected people. And we can see in our data set that 80% or 78% of our cyclones were actually landing, and they were responsible for affecting 94% of the population. So landing is a very important factor to determine the affected population. You can go to the next slide. So I won't go into much detail, of course, about this, but as I mentioned, we collected around 45 features, and we need to find the ones that we are obviously not going to use all of them. We need to find the ones that are relevant, the ones that can be important for determining the total affected that is highlighted in this slide in yellow. So just to guide you through this plot, we are looking for correlations, and the more green the colors are, it indicates a strong correlation. So we can see, for example, there is a strong correlation between rural population and landing and wind speed and exposed population and so on. And if they are more pink, they have an anti-correlation, which means the lower, for example, the GDP or the Human Development Index, the higher is the total affected. So like looking for correlations that are more green or more pink in this case, like in this color scale, gives us information on what is relevant, and the ones that are more white are not so important. So this was a way that we found out to just like, given all this data set that we gave that was very huge, how can we select the items that were actually important for our problem? So we can go to the next slide. And as we mentioned, we are trying to identify the affected population. This is what we mean by target variable. This is like a jargon expression. So here we have just distribution of the total affected population. Then here to the left, we have this as a function of income level. And from that, we can see that, for example, in purple, this is the low middle income, and in green is the high middle income. And these are the income levels that are the most affected. And you can see also that the total affected peaks around hundreds of thousands of people. So most of the cyclones that we have available will peak, will have an affected population of about 100,000. And but of course they can have higher affected population. In this case is usually associated to stronger cyclones or more vulnerable regions. So just to give some perspective, we are doing this project together with the World Food Program, and it's interesting to see here in this map. So here, this map, we also are showing the income level of the world, and then again, the darker areas are the ones that have the lowest income level. So you can see the highlighted in gray that these regions are the ones that the World Food Program is actually helping, and this shows that, at least from our data, that the cyclones that have the most affected population are from the low income level income countries, which are the countries that are being helped from the World Food Program. So we are all on the same page that it is already happening, that the countries that need the most help are the ones that are getting. So we can go to the next slide. So regarding our model strategy, I won't go into much detail, of course, on this. As I mentioned before, we wanted to, given all these features about cyclones and affected population and so on, we wanted to predict the people, how many people are affected given a cyclone. So for that, we used several state-of-art machine learning models. And since our group was very big, we had like at the beginning around 40 people, we had to divide this into several groups so we can be more efficient in our analysis. So we divided the groups into, each group will have a leader and a communicator and a mentor and the regular members. So here are the pictures of the leaders of our groups for each of the models that we selected. And the communicators would be the ones giving a summary of the results. The mentors would be the ones helping the other members that are not so familiar with the methods. So everybody could participate and help. And in particular, we used the random forest models, support vector machines, clustering neural networks, and we created a separated group for exploratory models, which were models more advanced or that were using like some different techniques that were not so state of the art, so to say. So we can go to the next slide. So just to give like a taste of what a data analysis or a data science project is, we had, of course, lots of problems on the way or lots of things to define on the way. So for example, we had a lot of missing data and we had to define how we are going to deal with that. Or for example, we had what is called categorical variables, which is basically things that are words. For example, the income level is not a number. So we have to create something that, how to transform this into a number that the models can calculate. We also had to do some feature engineering, which I mean by that is we had some features there in our data set, and we could transform them into something that is more insightful about the affected population. So for example, we had a feature that was called coordinates, which was basically giving the track of the cyclone. And we use this to calculate which cyclones are landing or not landing, which we showed already that this was very important for affected population. We did something similar with the timestamps that we had for the cyclones, like every couple of hours there were some checking the time when the cyclones were happening. We use this to calculate, for example, the total hours that a cyclone was in land, and which was actually also an important feature for our estimations. So we also had to standardize our models because as we saw we had like 5 different teams working different models, and we have to make sure that we were all on the same page. So, for example, we had several data sets, and then like we had like, I don't know, version 10, version 14, and we had to go through all of this to make sure that we are comparing the results with the same, using the same base model, and the same for other things as test size and the parameters and so on. So we can go to the next slide. And here I'm going to present just the preliminary results for the best performing model, which actually came from these exploratory models. So this model, the model used was ensemble models, which is a technique that basically combines several models. In this case, we used the random forest and extreme gradient boosting. These models were actually known for outperform other machine learning models and are famous for winning Kaggle competitions. So here, if you look to the right, you can see that we are separating our data set into different ranges of affected population, because as we have a very broad range of affected population, we figured that is the best way to communicate our results is to divide these into different ranges. So in this case here, we have an evaluation for up to 150,000 affected. So to evaluate this model, we have to compare the predicted values that are the ones in orange here to the actual values that came from the test set that are the ones in blue. And basically, if you look into the difference, like horizontally into the difference or the deviation from the blue curve, we can have our confidence interval. But it's also important to see that the two curves, though are shifted, they have more or less the same shape. So this gives us an idea that our model is performant to it's good enough to predict the same behavior as we are seeing in the data. And this difference, as I said, gives the confidence level. So in this case, we have for up to 150,000 affected people, we have a confidence interval of 19,000, about 19,000 affected populations. Going to the next slide, we can see the same analysis now for considering higher values for affected populations. Is the same data set and the same calculations and everything. We're just considering more affected population. So in this case, it's up to 450,000 affected. And then we can see that here the shift is already, the difference between the two predicted and affected is already not as precise as before. And here we already have a confidence interval of around 58,000. And if you go to the next slide, then we are considering the extreme cases that I mentioned, like the ones where we have already up to even 1 million affected population. And then in this case, you can see that our model doesn't perform as precise as before and this is mostly because of lack of data, because as I showed at the beginning, we have more data available for storms and not so much for high category cyclones that can affect more people. So yeah, so this was the end of part A that I mentioned at the beginning. So in which we calculated the affected population. Of course, we have the error bars and so on. You can go back to the next slide. And now I'm going to talk about the second part, which is the part B, as I call, which is the relief package tool that we created. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we came up with guidelines. We came across the guidelines from the World Health Organization, so the WHO, for the minimal nutrition. And given an affected population, we could calculate what is the minimum amount of calories that a person needs per day in terms of food, and also in terms of non-food items. We could calculate in terms of number of people or number of persons per household, for example, how many sanitary items they need, such as, like, I don't know, toothbrushes or toothpaste, shampoo, and so on, or blankets or tools for rebuilding the cities and so on. So, and important thing that we also take into account the demographics or the socioeconomic factors of these locations. So, for example, we have demographics regarding the vulnerable populations, such as children and breastfeeding mothers or pregnant women. So all of these items are taken into account when we come up with this relief package. So this is, of course, a prototype, so there is still work to be done. But the important thing is that it works. And this specific relief package can be used given a number of affected population and some other items that I'm going to show very soon. So this can be used not only for cyclones, this can be used for basically whatever kind of emergency that needs these relief packages, and this is very important to be mentioned. So now I'm going to pass the word to the next speaker that is going to present actually the prototype and continue with our discussion. Thank you.
Vamsi, do you want me to play the Juba video?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Team, this is the food packet tool what Rosanna explained.
So this is the tool we developed. First of all, we have to put the number of days to be covered. So we're interested to cover 7 days. And number of affected people, say 5,000 people got affected. And how many of them are pregnant? So you have to take the statistics, but say for our case, we put 40 lactating mothers, we put like 70, how many young boys? Now, for us, we took 20 degrees Celsius as the reference temperature, but if we change it to a lower value or higher value, the estimation will change accordingly. If you go down like 15 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Celsius, the calorie need goes high as per WHO guideline, and the tool takes care of that. So now you have the essential inputs, and this total number of affected people, although we did put manually, but in our whole project, this field will be automatically loaded from the AI-based model. This will be linked with that. So now that we have all the necessary input, we just click on Get Food Basket and we get the estimation of all the commodities. In our final prototype, we'll have like options to select among different food categories, but for this demonstration purpose, we kept it simple. So now you have the estimation of all the commodities. If you now would like to see, does it meet the minimum nutrition guideline? Then you just click on nutrition facts and you see how much calorie, how much protein and fat this will cover. And these are the 3 main nutrients in a balanced diet. So yes, we believe the tool is quite useful. You can avoid a lot of calculations, tedious calculations, I would say. And also you can prepare a standard food package, just not fill it up with chips and other snacks, which doesn't provide enough nutrition, and in some cases may be termed as junk food. But you can actually get a proper estimation of foods that will give the affected people enough nutrition, and it will be helpful for them. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Okay, with that said, I'm just passing the control. Vamsi, you can take the control.
Yeah, hello. So we have created a small demo for presenting our model. So I'll just share my screen. Yeah, I hope you're able to see my screen. So we
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, so we have created a small prototype in the past 2 days to make the inference visible. So currently I'm considering a cyclone for which we have data like this. We have the storm ID, the year, the basin which is empty, and the name, the time, the latitude, longitude, and the different wind speeds. So as you can see, there are lots of columns which are empty, and so we thought this would be a little bit more realistic to have something like this. So when we upload the same data set into our application, it basically initially creates a small visualization, as you can see on the map, of how the cyclone has come. And so once the cyclone is visualized, some pre-processing happens inside it, and you can generally choose the options which we have here. For example, you can choose the general category, the maximum wind, the minimum pressure, and the basin, sub-basin, the storm speed, and this VLAND is the speed of the cyclone when it lands on the land, and the Saffron-Simpson scale. So we have different algorithms which we have trained, and when we click on generate score for this matrix, so we get the population affected for each country code, ISO country code, which is currently represented as a 2-letter code here. So since it is currently category 1, we have a less population here, but if we increase to category 5 and then click on generate, you can see that there is an increase in the population. So this is a small tool which we have worked on to show for the demo. And the future work for this this tool might be the inclusion of the original data. For example, our model has predicted that 500,000 population has been affected, but actually 600,000 or 700,000 people were affected. So we can maybe possibly give a small column here where you can enter the true values, and when entered, it can be added to the original data set, and these models can be trained again to get the to reduce the error and give more accurate population. So this can be done for different algorithms as well. And this gives for different algorithms. So in order to see the pre-processing which we have done, so this is the original data which has been given. So here we are doing some pre-processing work to get the details from these UI which we have given, and then assembling everything. And as you can see from the initial data set, we don't have the country codes here, but we are getting the country codes using a reverse geocoder and then mapping it to the original population. I hope that is clear. And that's all from me.
It's awesome, Vamsi. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Rosanna.
I'm taking the control back.
So I think it's back to Anel, actually.
Okay. So we are done with this.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the future limitations, outlook, and potential of this project. We obviously had some limitations. We used only open source data, and that's why we may not have some information, but that World Food Bank maybe have themselves. Maybe they have more data. Or alternatively, if somebody else will inherit this project, they could look for more data. Just from what I know, right now we have around 1,000 rows. We had to drop about 200 because our data was sparse. That could have been avoided if we maybe had more time filled it in, but that would take about like 1 more month. But having more data would also improve accuracy of the model. So that would be important. Rosanna already mentioned that we have problem with outliers. We cannot just drop outliers like we usually do with any regular model, because outliers actually means that they're big cyclones, and big cyclones tend to have, you know, big devastation. And actually those are the ones that we need to predict more than anything else. So that was a big challenge for us. We also have we're proposing some improvements maybe in the future. We could use new relevant features, for example, elevation or flood risk. And that is because as much data as we collected, there is also few features. And from what we know from the research is that elevation, flood risk is a very important factor in how many people are going to be affected by the cyclone. And automated inclusion of the feature cyclone. That's what Vamsi discussed. We created that tool very fast. Thank you so much for everybody who contributed. I mean, the UI tool that Vamsi demonstrated. So actually there is one more feature that could be included, that if World Food Bank is using that tool, number could be slightly off, but they could enter the correct number. And the next time model predicts the cyclone, maybe for the next cyclone, the data that was entered today is also considered into the training, which also will improve accuracy. Next slide, please. Opportunities for the improvement, as I mentioned, we could include more features. And we also could do open source data set, so researchers from all over the world could access it. That was a tremendous work that has been done to join this data set. And I'm pretty sure there are researchers and people who would be interested in tapping into that problem. Next slide, please. Another proposal is approach the same problem, but from the point of view of convolutional neural network. That would be a classical problem where we have, let's say, 3 layers, maybe more. The first layer would be a layer similar to that Susan was discussing, which is density of the population. The second layer would be elevation, and the third would be the terrain. If we combine those layers, feed it to CNN, and try to produce the label variable that we already have, that may lead to some interesting and maybe even more accurate results, because it would be considering both some socioeconomical situation, which is density. It would be considering what kind of area a person is living in, right? And like I mentioned, elevation, also very important. Next one. And I'm going to give word to Rosanne.
So thanks for all the speakers. Just now present the final remarks, which is here basically just stating the sources of our work from IBTEX and that TC, that Omdena, World Food Program, World Bank, and the greater population of the world. So I can go to the next slide. And here I just want to show all of our collaborators that contributed immensely to this project. We had around 19 countries contributing, 15 nationalities, around 11 women. And here are highlighted around in this map here of the world. And it's important to mention that like this was a very diverse group, and it was a very intense work. So we are all very proud. And you can go to the next slide. And here is just like, so you guys can see our faces, and we now open for Q&A, and thank you all for staying here for this rather long presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, we've kind of overshot the time, but for those of you who can't stay, please email your questions to the email ID you got the registration link from, and we will surely respond to them. But for those of you who can stay, I invite you to ask questions and comments. And thank you so much to the presenters. Also our WFP partners, Nithima, Raghu, and Kyriakos, thank you so much for joining and guiding us through this. And if you have any questions, we would be grateful to answer them.
Hi guys, so this is Nithima from the World Food Program. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Nithima, please.
Well, first of all, I really wanted to thanks everybody for your hard work. I'm really impressed by all the work and time you put in that challenges, especially as we were also like the world was kind of going into crisis at the same time. So it's true that we didn't know like if people would like be as participative as it is usually with Omdena, and so we're really impressed by the result as well. And as you were presenting, I was already like chatting with my colleagues, like, oh, we should present that to like other colleagues like within WFP, like our like supply chain colleagues, and we have some GIS colleagues also like working on cyclone, and so we were already like talking about like how to share the result and where to take it next, because we really think there's some potential for us to be able to use it as well. I just had maybe like 2 quick questions. So the first one was on the performance of the model. So I saw that you guys have also like separated the performance of the model like based on like how big was the cyclone. My question here was like, did you also try to look at like region, like, you know, like is the model that you created perform better in some region than other, like region where you would have like more data than other?
No, I personally didn't. Maybe somebody else did. I just noticed without any analysis that our outliers lay in China. So maybe, I don't know if that is important piece of information for you guys. Do you serve country of China? Like, does it happen too often that you would have to?
Not really, because so as you mentioned, like we usually operate in countries that have let's say like less mean to operate themselves. So let's say like, you know, when a hurricane like hit the US, they usually already have like disaster preparedness resources, and so we would be less active here than, for instance, like the last cyclone we operate a lot was like in the Caribbean or in Mozambique. So maybe like more the coast of like East Africa and Caribbean. So I was wondering if maybe you had looked at the result of the cyclone more specifically in these regions.
No, we didn't, but that's
Okay.
a good idea.
And my other question was, while you were doing all this research, did you stumble upon like any other research in the same field that could be interesting for us to connect as we progress, like we try to take this forward? To operationalize it? Were there other groups or other researchers or other organizations that were like trying to work on such models?
So if you guys don't mind, I will just jump in. So I would say that at least from my view, we didn't really go so much into this because we were trying to focus more on the cyclones. But as I mentioned, the tool that is created for the package, the relief package, in principle can be used not like only for cyclones, but like these calculations that is like automated and so on can be used for, you know, earthquakes or whatever other kind of natural disasters.
Okay.
I don't know if that was your question.
Yeah. And I guess my last question was more on the, maybe less on the AI model, maybe more on the part B, you know, the mathematical model for food and supply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did you calculate that? Did you just like calculate based on the calorie?
So
intake?
Let me just take my notes. So for the food items, yeah, so there are like different kinds. There's a list of items that can be used, for example, like fortified blended food or meat or, you know, sugar and so on. And there are like guidelines, and we use the WHO guidelines for that, for estimating these items, like in terms of how many calories a person needs per day. And for the non-food items, this is still like in progress, so that's why we didn't show it yet. But we also have already, like we have a table basically with a list of items and which items are necessary per household, which items are necessary per person, and which items are necessary for vulnerable populations, such as, for example, lactant women need vitamin A or some other replacements for food or like more nutritious things. And this is also being taken into account. And also, like as Juber mentioned, we take into account the temperature, which is also something that is important, like because the temperature of a place will influence on how much calories a person needs per day. So if it's a location that is a bit colder, it's I don't remember like on the top of my head, but I think it's like the base is like 20 degrees Celsius, and if it's 5 degrees less, this person will need, I don't know if it's 100 or 200 more kilocalories per day. So this is all being taken into account.
Okay. And did you also look at, so when you say like non-food items, did you also look at like shelters and things like that, or were you focusing on?
So for the non-food items, like we didn't consider shelters specifically, but we consider for example, mattresses and blankets and sanitary or hygiene items such as soap and things like that, and also items for construction like shovels and hammers and also ropes and so on.
Yeah, that would be like, I think for us, like really, really interesting to like dig into also the non-food items, just because the World Food Program is more specialized in food. So it's true that we have like nutrition departments that look usually at the nutrition and food value a lot, but we have much less people actually looking at the non-food item, while we also deliver this item, because usually we're one of the first organization to arrive after disaster strike. So it's also, that would be really interesting, like if it's possible to see it when you guys work on it. Love that. Thanks.
Rosanna, this is Mauricio, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Okay. Sorry if I'm jumping in front of anybody. First of all, congratulations to the team. It's a very interesting exercise. Obviously, you focused on one of the multiple aspects in which artificial intelligence and machine learning can be used for disaster response, which is basically predicting exposure and need of specific, in this case, a specific relief package. And let's not forget that obviously AI and machine learning can be used for a lot of other very important parts of disaster response, no? Like, for example, learning lessons for improved practices on the basis of comparable events, which is something that you did touch upon a little bit. Like geotagging damage and access routes for relief workers and things of that sort, not to plan optimal delivery routes and so on. Anyway, I had a specific question because in order to train the models, you mentioned that you would basically go back and see what the reports of people who were impacted by a given event, and then to basically input that data on top of the numbers that your current model gives you. But I think that that's, I would like to make an observation that assumes a steady state of hazards and vulnerability. And this goes to the observation of the previous questioner, which has to do with, are there any more, is there more variability in a given region of the planet than another? Well, unfortunately, people that are exposed to disasters, and in this case, cyclones, are typically the people who are, for example, informal settlers in areas that are more disaster prone. So, and those settlements have specific dynamic patterns that actually make them to change a lot from one year to the next, particularly if there is a reconstruction effort going on. So do not assume that if something 10 years ago produced in a given region in the Pacific, 70,000 people impacted by the event, that's going to be exactly the same number of people that are going to be impacted, because the size of the human settlements change enormously. The types of infrastructures, typically not very sturdy infrastructures, change a lot. So I'm a little concerned about this business of training the models on the basis of those previous reports of impacted people. That said, and also there's quite a bit of work by groups in different parts of the world on similar applications like the one that you present. So you present yourselves as, oh, this is the very first in the world. I would very respectfully and with a lot of tender love for you guys, be careful with those types of statements, because people might come back at you and say, wait a minute, we've been working at this for 15 years and all of a sudden you are the only ones in the world that have thought about this and generated a solution, no? Using artificial intelligence. So anyway, that a word of caution in that regard. Anyway, excellent, very interesting work. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mauricio. It's very nice to see you here. And I always like so much to hear your comments. They are always very insightful. And yes, I agree that we have to tone a bit down, like in terms of being the first, like, but like as to our knowledge, is being the first for using AI for cyclones specifically. So it's a bit more specific. And coming back to your comment regarding the societies and so on changing and infrastructure changing, just to make it clear, we did use the reports for the calculations for the second part, which was for estimating the items. But for the affected population, we use the data, like especially like I think a little bit what you're talking about, the socioeconomical data from the World Bank. So this is like, this was a lot of work actually from one of our sub-teams, so to say, that is taking into account this several indicators that we selected, and also along the years. So of course, the data is not perfect. There are some data missing and so on, but we, to some extent at least, of course, it's not perfect, but we are taking into account, for example, we had a look into, I won't know by heart now, but like several socioeconomical impacts, for example, savings for school and age of starting school and so on. So we did this part, I didn't mention it because in the end we didn't use, to see if there was some correlation. And but we are taking socioeconomical data into account, especially like HDI and GDP. And of course, like there is also infrastructure. Like one thing that I personally think is still missing in our models that should be very important is access to electricity. And the reason why we didn't use this indicator is because we didn't have enough data available. So we would have too many missing values and would kind of like not be so nice for the performance of the models. But yes, for sure, like infrastructure is important, and we could somehow, if we get better data from World Bank or some other source, kind of at least touch a little bit upon this point that you made.
Thanks for that. And obviously, and you just between the lines touched on something that's very important. This is a tool that is applicable, obviously, for the acute response immediately after a cyclone. It is very interesting to look at what the AI and ML applications might be as the time after the critical event happened evolves. Why? Because that's where, in my opinion, and what I expect, where AI and ML might help us even more, because it truly the predictive capabilities of analyzing lots of data are going to allow us to plan better for recovery and reconstruction. Yes, obviously you are addressing a very, very important part of what we need to do immediately after a disaster, sure. But AI and ML have this huge potential in the succeeding phases of disaster response. And I would invite you, and I say this because as you probably know, I've helped coordinate response in large scale emergencies in different regions of the world for the past well, quite a few years. I don't want to date myself. But anyway, that's really, for me, what I anticipate more from AI and ML is even more on that. So anyway, that said, I would invite all of you to keep thinking about these issues and what those possible applications might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Suzanne wants to respond. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, okay. 2 points concerning the population growth in certain areas of the world. We are aware of the problem. the data that we had as the basis was gridded population data sets for the years 2000, 2005, 2010, and 15. 2020 just appeared like last week. You have just seen it online that it's available now. And basically we were extracting the exposed population based on the data set which is closest to that one, and then we're doing an adjustment based on the population growth of that country. But for sure, population growth of a country is never a linear thing. If you hit one of the mega cities, it will be totally different than if you hit a rural area. So we are aware of this problem. The second thing, what we were addressing, considering the time factor, it was one of the first 2 weeks we were discussing, hey, if we could get like all the delivery bills, the way bills of whatever World Food Program was shipping out there, that would be the treasure trove to dive into and extract the data. But unfortunately, we couldn't get that data. That was what our first approach. And then we said, okay, if we can't get this, then we have to do something which is just extracting the data that we can get our hands on.
Thank you, Suzanne. I would like to now go to Javier, who had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just a bit of context through to the question. So you mentioned that there's the phases, right? So one is solved through an artificial intelligence model, and the other one is through a mathematical model, and then there's a connection in between them, which is this affected population. And then so also relating it to from the World Food Program attendee that said about non-food items, so that there's if this mathematical model has into account not only the food but these other items, I was wondering if you thought as a further improvement in this connection between these two models, because I see, for example, that in the AI model, you do a pre-processing. You even thought about these convolutional neural networks in order to pre-process this imagery. And I was wondering, for example, if you pre-process some imagery related to infrastructure, so how many schools are affected, or how many roads are affected, or how many other things are affected, if you can input this to this mathematical model also, and not seeing it as two phases, but as a whole model, which this pre-process information is used also for this mathematical model. So I don't know if you thought you have some thoughts on that.
I don't know if someone wants to answer to that.
I want to just chip in. It's not exactly an answer, but we also have, for example, number of injured or toll death. Number in injured would really be helpful, but unfortunately we didn't collect enough data. But in the future, if we collect enough data, at least that will help. And I will let Rosanne answer a question about CNN and the rest.
Oh, yeah, I think there is, as Anil said, there is a lot of room for improvement, and most of the things, like the ideas that you guys are giving, are really, really good. And some of them we already had ourselves, but we had really this problem with the time. So we kind of had to come up with something that works in 2 months. So it was kind of like a little bit limited what we can do. But for sure, also another important thing is that wherever calculations we make come with errors, and we have to take this into account. And so we also want to implement the error bars for the tool. So we have this plus minus, as much as we had for plus minus in terms of affected population, we have plus minus in terms of items. And yes, for sure, like I think if you could have image recognition, this could help a lot. Also, the thing I already mentioned about electricity and so on, because this, if you don't have power supply, you might also have all sorts of other problems, and this is for sure something to be implemented.
maybe let me rephrase the question. So why didn't you thought of a model which integrated everything in it, and why did you decided to separate it? So which was the idea on separating it?
So for the so as I mentioned at the beginning, like originally we thought, okay, that's not so complicated. We just see, for example, we just go through the data from the World Food Program and see how many items they ship to some countries during some emergency. And this would be like the first, like the straight in the problem. But the things that we didn't have this data available. So as we already mentioned, we did everything with open source data. And then we managed to find the guidelines for calculating this, but there's not so much data available. We had this discussion with the World Food Program team that helped us, that this requires a lot of bureaucracy and so on. So of course, like, in principle, it could be done, but it's still having a notion of how the affected population is impacted by other factors, like socioeconomical and so on, is also important, even for other disasters as well.
Okay. And then just the last, okay, sorry.
I also wanted to mention that when we're given assignments, we're specifically told not to use imagery data. So we're limited by tabular data. We would be really, really excited to do CNN. Like that's the dream of every data scientist, to do neural networks. But we had assignment to work.
Yeah,
with
maybe another challenge. Let's see.
Okay.
Rosanna, may I make a quick comment? This is Mauricio.
Yes, please go ahead.
You and some of the members of your team have heard me talk about this before. Obviously, what you did is what you were challenged to do, and it responds to a degree to the mandate of the UN agency that actually you worked with, which has to do more with, okay, what's in the relief package, for the food relief package and the NFIs that accompany that typically. When an event like a cyclone occurs, obviously the people in harm's way are put in critical scarcity of their multi-dimensional needs. You've heard me talk about this before.
Yes.
Okay, yes, it would be lovely to have an ML and AI solution that will help us to put together all those typical, and they are predictable, typical needs, in this case for this type of event, because by the way, the typical needs for different types of events are slightly different. But let's stick to hurricanes and cyclones. It is possible to go ahead and say, okay, what's the typical profile of multidimensional needs? You have addressed already one, which is, okay, food and NFIs that accompany these typical baskets that are given to people so they can eat and survive during the critical phase. But is it possible to integrate and to have a solution that actually predicts the needs in response to those multidimensional critical scarcities? I believe that it is. As a matter of fact, every time that I've been part of what is called the interagency coordination space, be it if cluster mechanisms are activated or not, whatever, every time I put this on the table, we need to have an integrated look and to try to do a coordinated, holistic response. So let it be, I use this opportunity to also invite you to keep this in your minds, because AI and ML have a huge potential to permit the development of a solution that would make this possible. And obviously then UN agencies and other actors in response would be prompted to say, okay, let's stop being so siloed and let's try to work together and to really present a coordinated, multi-dimensional response. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mauricio. Yes, absolutely. Like I think that whenever, as some of you know, like I have an academic background, and it's always very complicated for me at least, to put these social problems, because in the end, natural disasters are for sure social problems, because it involves the lives of other people and behavior, and this is not something so clear sometimes to predict. And putting this together with this model mathematical approach of AI, it's very, very important. And there is a lot of, at least from my perspective, there's a lot of still miscommunication and limited communication. So for example, there are works out there for sure regarding AI to humanitarian response, not only for cyclones, but for other things too, but there are still very few. So I think it's very important in this challenge that we actually started this conversation, that we, we took this like a first step into, doing something in this direction and putting all these people together and understanding what they need, for maybe other humanitarian agencies could also join the conversation. Then we see that maybe they provide some other sort of aid, and it can be also very useful for that too. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yes, and the last comment, then I'll shut up. You obviously are using individual lives as the subjects of exposure, but let's remember, and here again, AI has this beautiful opportunity. Let's remember that populations can also be subjects of analysis, and that they provide different insights, because all of a sudden, if you look at population dynamics and population exposures, you have a set of emerging things that are not obvious when you just simply look at individuals. Just to say that. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and congratulations again. Very nice, very interesting work.
Thank you.
And, I just wanted to maybe like chip in one last time. I just wanted to say, apologize from our side for not being able to share the data, because I know that must have been very frustrating. We actually had a discussion before with Omdena if we should try to have a challenge with a data sharing agreement, but just exploring a bit on our side. So, like we're part of the innovation accelerator of WFP, but WFP is a very like old-fashioned organization. And so we heard that data sharing agreement takes years, like not months, but years. So we thought that it's better to get something started, and with the result, maybe be able to convince our colleague of the usefulness of machine learning and AI to our response. So sorry for that, and thank you very much again.
Thank you, Nathima. Thank you so much, Nathima. Are there any other questions? Okay, since you guys are not raising your hands, all right, again, that option of emailing us your questions still is open. So anybody who wants to engage with or interact with Omdena, or even has certain questions, please email them to us.
I do have another question. Just maybe I'm new to Omdena, but I was wondering, Omdena, but I was wondering, you were talking about the improvement possibilities, and who would keep going with that work? Or so is it also part of your work to try and give let's say visibility to the work, or is it Nathima who has to do that, or how does it usually work? Because yeah.
David, I don't know if you want to answer that, or otherwise I can also go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, Laura, unless you want to answer that, I would just say that these challenges are voluntary 8-week challenges, but of course, sometimes people use the same information or work on it more in future challenges as well, which can be more concentrated and be more pointed in the sense that you're talking about. But of course, this data will be used by WFP as well, and yeah, we'll be posting about it too. So yeah, that's from my side.
Sure.
Okay, I want to extend my sincere. Sorry.
Devika, I was just going to pipe in. This is Laura.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, so certainly if the World Food Program wants to continue with this work on their own, we provide, Omdena provides all these models and the data to them. We sometimes do follow-up projects with our partners, and we're always open to that. And typically we put all of this material into the public domain. It's open source, so that we're moving the field forward for those who want to pick this up and continue to do to do further work on it outside of our organization and outside of our partners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and
Thank
also
you.
just like a final comment regarding this project specifically. Yes, as Laura and Devika already said, like at least for, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure that this is also the mindset of many people in our group. So this, what we are doing, it's an exercise. We learned a lot, and all these people are interested, of course, in artificial intelligence, data science, and so on. But we are doing something that can really help. So I think in this sense, like, for example, we are planning to writing an article, like a scientific article about it. I am actually starting to write it soon. And so this, actually your comments and so on are also very welcome because they can help us with this process. And this can also help like this, not necessarily promotion, but like communication of our results, communication of what can be done, communication that was already done, and this, what is this data that we collected and so on, is, as Laura said very well, to push it a bit further. And so we can actually do AI for good, which is kind of like the logo or the motivation that we have in this project.
I think that's really important because some researchers tend on problems who are actually don't solve any problem. So maybe if some researchers concentrate in solving some real problems, that would be even better. So yeah, it was just a funny comment. Thank you.
Yeah, Javier, I mean, this data will be open source, as Laura said. So all collaborators, including everybody who's worked for this challenge and who's not, has the liberty to kind of use it for further research. All right, just to end the call now, because we've actually overshot, unless there are any questions. I want to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to Raghu, Nithima, and Karikos from WFP for joining and guiding the team, and all the collaborators as well who worked extremely tirelessly on the challenge. And of course, my colleagues from Omdena, whose guidance and support was there throughout the course of the challenge as well. So thank you again to all our esteemed guests also who joined the webinar and make the experience of learning and sharing a lot more vibrant. Please be in touch with us over email. Laura has shared her email ID as well. And you can always email us over the email ID that was shared on the registration link from where you registered. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Lovely work. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.